Government ethics constitutes the application of ethical rules to government. It is that part of practical jurisprudence, or the philosophy of law, that governs the operation of government and its relationship with the people that it governs. It covers issues of honesty and transparency in government, dealing with matters such as bribery, political corruption, police corruption, legislative ethics, regulatory ethics, conflict of interest, avoiding the appearance of impropriety, open government, and legal ethics. The U.S. Office of Government Ethics was initiated by the Ethics in Government Act of 1978 to provide overall leadership and policy direction for an ethics program in the executive branch of government. This same picture is mirrored, albeit in a patchy way, across U.S. state administrations. Altogether, the U.S. model of public sector ethics has become highly regulated and, some would say, cumbersome. Government officials serve the people, managing the resources of others. Along with this stewardship, there is an expectation from the public that in conducting daily activities, the officials will practice fairness and equality. They are also expected to maintain openness in their workings, to ensure that they are operating within the public's perception of what is right. This concept of ethics, a branch of philosophy which seeks to address morality, is not a relatively new idea within government. Niccolò Machiavelli wrote The Prince, which serves as a manual to illustrate what a monarchy should do to maintain power. This treatise is often viewed as a tool of how a public official should not act in modern society, as it is an enumeration of the specific steps one should take to maintain control and power. This idea of control and power conflicts with the underlying principle of being a steward to the general public. As such, this treatise is a springboard for ethical issues in modern-day times. Paul Douglas, a former United States Senator from Illinois, argues that while many may secretly follow Machiavelli in their heart, most do not. Instead, most men want a life of integrity and goodwill in which public officials are stewards rather than masters and treat their jobs as a means of helping people rather than dominating them. Douglas further argues why ethical practices are needed. Our government is now so huge and affects our lives so directly that we cannot be content with merely a moderately decent level of behavior on the part of our public officials. For even a small percentage of misbehavior on the part of these officials can do a vast amount of harm. Regulatory ethics is a body of law and practical political philosophy that governs the conduct of civil servants and the members of regulatory agencies. It addresses issues such as bribery and the relationship of civil servants with the businesses and the industries they regulate, as well as concerns about transparency, freedom of information and sunshine laws, and conflict of interest rules. While Machiavelli and Douglas are distant in time, the two opposing viewpoints of the types of public administrators, and the ethical stance of the decisions they make, are very relevant today. Further illustrating the bifurcation of thought on ethics in government, Cody and Lynn discuss the two opposing factors, utilitarians and deontologists. Utilitarians believe that the end sought justifies the means to that end. In other words, if an ethical solution is more costly, a utilitarian will argue from a standpoint of efficiency or effectiveness to justify a less ethical solution. Deontologists believe that certain absolute principles should be obeyed, regardless of the consequences. An example of an absolute principle would be honesty. The definition of these two behavioral models is not necessarily exclusive. It is possible for a person to make a decision based upon a utilitarian stance and then follow a deontological stance for a separate decision. This is because the concept of ethics is vague and ultimately is based upon principles and values, which will differ among situations and people. Code of conduct is a set of rules outlining the social norms and rules and responsibilities of, or proper practices for, an individual, party or organization. Related concepts include ethical, honor, moral codes and religious laws. In its 2007 International Good Practice Guidance, defining and developing an effective code of conduct for organizations, the International Federation of Accountants provided the following working definition: principles, values, standards, or rules of behavior that guide the decisions, procedures and systems of an organization in a way that A. contributes to the welfare of its key stakeholders, and B. respects the rights of all constituents affected by its operations. A common code of conduct is written for employees of a company, which protects the business and informs the employees of the company's expectations. It is ideal for even the smallest of companies to form a document containing important information on expectations for employees. The document does not need to be complex or have elaborate policies, but the file needs a simple basis of what the company expects from each employee. A code of conduct can be an important step in establishing an inclusive culture, but it is not a comprehensive solution on its own. An ethical culture is created by the organization's leaders who manifest their ethics in their attitudes and behavior. Studies of codes of conduct in the private sector show that their effective implementation must be part of a learning process that requires training, consistent enforcement, and continuous measurement/improvement. Simply requiring members to read the code is not enough to ensure that they understand it and will remember its contents. The proof of COC effectiveness is when employees/members feel comfortable enough to voice concerns and believe that the organization will respond with appropriate action.
Public officials are expected to act for the public good, not their own personal interests. That means they should never unduly benefit from their official position. Being in a situation where they might is called a conflict of interest. A conflict of interest exists when a reasonable person might perceive that a public official's personal interests could be favoured over their public duties. For example, the heritage officer at a council also has a private business providing heritage advice to the property industry. From time to time, the heritage officer's private clients submit development applications to the council that he has to assess. A university is running a tender process for a new building project, but a person involved has a friend who wants to bid for the work. A compliance officer who has to investigate unlawful behaviour by a business run by the captain of his football team. But how do you know if you have a conflict of interest? Here are 4 things to consider. First, think about your personal interests. These include your financial interests, such as sources of income, investments, and debts. Your relationships with family and friends, but also business associates, people in sporting or community groups, even your social media contacts. Next, think about your public duties, all of the things in your job description and the tasks that your agency requires you to perform, but also to serve the public interest and act ethically at all times. Now, consider whether there is a connection or overlap between your personal interests and your public duties. Finally, you need to consider whether a reasonable person might perceive that the personal interest could be favoured. There are 2 common mistakes that people make. The first mistake is to forget that a conflict arises when a personal interest could be favoured over public duties. Even if you don't take any action to favour your personal interest, you still have a conflict of interest. Let's take an earlier example. If a public official is working on a tender at a university and knows that her friend wants to submit a bid, she has a conflict of interest, even if she never does anything to benefit her friend. The second most common mistake people make is not to disclose the conflict of interest. Because we see ourselves as ethical, honourable people, it can be challenging to imagine ourselves ever doing the wrong thing. Putting it another way, you're not allowed to decide that you don't have a conflict of interest just because you rate yourself as an honest person. So, how do you declare a conflict of interest? Your agency should have a process in place. But, in a nutshell, it should be done in writing, be timely, be accurate. Remember, it only requires a few minutes to protect yourself. After all, a public official who takes advantage of a conflict of interest to obtain a benefit for themselves or someone close to them is probably engaging in corrupt conduct. Also, keep in mind that intentionally concealing or understating a conflict of interest is dishonest and is likely to constitute corrupt conduct. Once you disclose the conflict of interest, your agency then comes up with a plan to manage it. Whatever is decided, you're expected to cooperate to make sure the public interest is put first. So, the key things to remember are: 1. Conflicts of interest occur when a reasonable person might perceive that your personal interests could be favoured over your public duties. 2. If you conceal, understate, or take advantage of a conflict of interest, you might be engaging in corrupt conduct. 3. Disclose your conflict of interest and comply with the plan put in place to manage it.
Republic Act number 6713. This is the act establishing a code of conduct and ethical standards for public officials and employees. This is to uphold the time-honored principles of public office, being a public trust, and granting incentives and rewards for exemplary service, enumerating prohibited acts and transactions, and providing penalties for violations thereof and for other purposes. Section 1 of this act is entitled, the title of this act is to be known as the Code of Conduct and Ethical Standards for Public Officials and Employees. Now, since you are the future of our law enforcement, then it is mandatory for us to have this subject, Code of Conduct and Ethical Standards for Public Officials and Employees. Section 3, definition of terms as used in this act. So we have the following terms. You can refer to your module, and I hope you have your module with you right now, because we will not be discussing all of this one by one. We will only be discussing the salient, the important points here. So as much as possible, when we have discussion like this, if we have presentations like this, nandyan din yung module ninyo for you to be able to follow the discussions. So the definition of the following are found in your module. Nandiyan naman lahat yan, yung government, alam naman natin to. Ano yung government? Ayun yung public officials. Ano yung gift? Ano yung receiving any gift? Loan, utang. Substantial stakeholder, ang ibig sabihin yan guys, lahat ng tao, any person who owns directly or indirectly shares or stock sufficient to elect a director of a corporation. Ang term na yan shall also apply to parties to a voting trust. Then we have family of public officials. Ano bang ibig sabihin ng family of public officials? Ito yung spouses and unmarried children under 18 years old or under 18 years of age. Conflict of interest, ang ibig sabihin yan, conflict of interest arises when a public official or employee is a member of a board, an officer, or substantial stockholder of a private corporation or owner, or has a substantial interest in the business. Divestment, we'll be talking about that later. Relatives naman refers to any and all persons related to a public official or employee within the fourth civil degree of consanguinity or affinity, including yung mga bilas, inso, and balae. Now, Section 4, Norms of Conduct of Public Officials and Employees. A. Commitment to public interest. It is expected for you, as future of law enforcement, as future public servants to uphold public interest. Yun talaga pinakataas natin. And to avoid, aside from upholding public interest, is to avoid wastage in public funds and revenues. Ibig sabihin, public officials and employees shall always uphold the public interest over and above personal interest. So, ang pinaka-priority natin is public interest over our own personal interest. Yung atin namang mga government resources and powers of your respective offices must be employed and used efficiently, effectively, honestly, and economically. This is to avoid wastage in public funds and revenues. So hopefully wala na tayong nakikitang mga vehicle na may nakatatak na for official use only na ginagamit during Sundays na kasama yung pamilya ng empleyado na pumupunta sa mga beach resources, yung mga pumupunta sa swimming pool and other resort. Next is professionalism. It is expected for us public employees to have the highest degree of excellence, professionalism, and skills in the performance of duties. Kasi nga, we will be serving the people. You will be serving the people. We are in the service of the people. Kaya kailangan makitaan tayo ng excellence. Kailangan makitaan tayo ng professionalism. Kailangan makitaan tayo ng skills in the performance of our duties. Kaya mahirap pumasok sa government office. Mahirap pumasok sa government service. Napakataas ng standard qualifications. Because we need them. We need that. We need this qualification for us to be able to give a service to the public efficiently and effectively. Of course, second is the utmost devotion and dedication to duty. Kahit nga pandemic, nakikita niyo pa rin yung ating mga kapulisan na nag-duty, yung ating mga kasundaluhan na nasa duty, yung mga teachers natin, no? Kahit nasa bahay lang, ang busy-busy nila because of printing modules, doing presentations and all sa online classes. These are utmost devotion and dedication to duty. Professionalism yan. And of course, justness and sincerity. In the context of the law, justness means an impartial decision of conflicting claims. Sincerity, on the other hand, may be defined as a state of mind which is truthful, free from deceit or hypocrisy. So, justice and sincerity. Expected yan sa mga public officials and public employees natin. So, we do not discriminate against anyone. Especially yung mga nasa marginalized areas of the community or sectors of the community, yung mga underprivileged, yung poor. We do not extend undue favors on account of our offices. At all times, we shall respect the rights of others and shall refrain from doing acts of contrary to law, good morals, good customs, public policy, and so on. That is expected to us. Justness and sincerity. We need to be truthful. We need to do our work honestly. Walang hypocrisy, walang deceit.